They said I was late. Not out loud, of course. Not directly. But I saw it in their eyes. The sideways glances, the whispered exchanges, the way Aunt Marlena's lips tightened as I stepped through the chapel doors 20 minutes into the service. It was my father's funeral. And I walked in alone. No black dress. No tears on my cheeks. Just a pressed gray coat buttoned to the collar, a plain envelope in one hand and my other hand resting lightly against my hip, where a badge should have been, if anyone had believed me. I stood in the back, quiet, observing, like I'd been trained to do. The pews were full, family on the right. Old neighbors, retired factory workers, and church members on the left. And at the front, standing like a pastor who didn't get the memo this wasn't his sermon, was Uncle Russell. My dad's brother. Former city councilman. Currently a bitter man with too much time and a microphone. He was a good man, Russell was saying. A hard worker. A soldier who didn't just talk about sacrifice, he lived it. Unlike some people who claim uniforms they never earned. There it was, the jab. A pause spread through the room like spilled ink. People didn't turn to look at me, but their shoulders stiffened. Their silence pointed sharper than fingers. Russell cleared his throat and continued. My brother deserved a daughter who understood loyalty. Who showed up when it mattered. Not one who sent voicemails from airports and called that love. That line stung because it wasn't entirely false. I hadn't visited much, not since the deployment, not since Dad's last hospitalization, not since the surgeries, the confusion, the slow forgetting of who I was, but I had called. I'd flown home twice under emergency leave. I'd sent support through channels no one at that funeral even knew existed. And the reason no one knew? Because my job required it. They didn't know that when I said consulting. I meant briefing a NATO Cyber Defense Committee under alias. They didn't know that, I can't talk right now, meant I was embedded in a joint task force tracking foreign infiltration patterns through encrypted military cloud. All they saw was absence, so they filled it with judgment. Russell glanced back at the closed casket, hand resting theatrically on its lid. My brother served with honor, and I won't let anyone diminish that legacy, not even family. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second. I didn't flinch. Because if he knew who he was speaking to, who I'd become, he might have stepped away from that microphone on his own. Instead, he kept talking. He asked for a quiet ceremony. No medals, no folded flags, no government hands at the burial. I think deep down, he was tired of politics. Tired of people who wore the title of patriot but forgot what it meant. More murmurs, some heads nodded. I stood still, shoulders square, letting them believe what they wanted, because I didn't come here to defend my reputation. I came for something else. The chapel air was thick, old wood, cheap cologne, sorrow that smelled like dust. But beneath all of that was something sharper, assumption. They had decided who I was, and funerals, they reveal more than death. They expose where people think you stopped growing. To them, I was still Julia, the girl who left town too fast, missed Sunday calls, and never explained what she really did for a living. But they didn't know what was in the envelope I held. They didn't know who would arrive at 10:47 sharp. They didn't know my name appeared on a manifest under clearance level Echo Black. And they didn't know that my father, despite what Russell claimed, had asked for one specific thing before he passed. Jules, he'd whispered through cracked lips 2 nights before the morphine took him. Promise me, silver flag, no church pageantry, no politics, just the real thing. I promised, and today I would keep that promise, whether Russell liked it or not. I used to believe my father was a giant. Not because he was tall, he was. Not because he yelled, he didn't. But because when I was 6, I saw him stand between a buckled fuel tank and a trembling second lieutenant and say, "We don't leave our own." Never. That line stuck with me, etched into the space between my lungs like another set of ribs. Dad didn't talk much about his time overseas, not directly. But you could see it in the way he folded towels with military precision, the way he triple-checked the front door every night. The way he paused before speaking, like every word had to pass through 3 filters first: truth, necessity, and what it would cost to say aloud. He was disciplined, but not rigid. Kind, but not soft. When Mom died of lymphoma, it was just the two of us. He raised me between duty rotations and radiation appointments, taught me how to tie a square knot with frayed shoelaces, how to keep breathing when the pain comes in waves. We didn't cry in front of each other, not once. Not when the doctor said 3 months, maybe 4. Not when I found her bathrobe still warm on the back of the door. Instead, he took my hand one night and whispered, "Some things you carry, not to forget, but to remember who you had the strength to love." He never remarried, he never needed to. I filled the space Mom left. He filled the world I didn't know I was being shaped for. We built our own rhythm. Coffee at 5:30, silence until 6, and then tactical debate over which cereal brand had the best crunch-to-price ratio. He called me Kessler more than kid. Always said it like a teammate, a comrade. By the time I was 14, I could field strip and reassemble a sidearm blindfolded. By 16, I hacked the high school's attendance system, not to skip class, but to correct it when they mislogged my perfect record. Dad just shook his head and smiled. God help whoever underestimates you, Kessler. But the world didn't believe in quiet girls with calloused hands and encrypted minds. Not in our town. By 17, I was already that kid. Too intense, too smart, too unsettling. Uncle Russell once told my dad at a barbecue, "Don't know what you're raising, Luke, a soldier or a spook." Dad didn't respond. He just sipped his coffee and squeezed my shoulder. I took the insult as a badge. The week I turned 18, I disappeared. That's how they tell it now, that I ran off. Cut ties. Stopped answering messages. But the truth is simpler and far harder to explain. I was recruited. Not by a college or even the army in its usual form. By a man named Briggs. No last name. No agency disclosed. He showed up in a navy blue sedan with no plates, handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Your test scores flagged something. Come to the briefing center in Arlington. Bring nothing but your brain." I left that night. Didn't even tell Dad where I was going. He didn't ask. Just handed me a folded pocket knife and said, "Use it wisely or not at all." He knew, somehow he always knew. The years that followed rewrote me, not all at once. Not loudly, just bit by bit, like fog rolling in through old windows. First came the language immersion. Then the zero-trace living protocols. Then satellite pattern analytics, AI disruption anticipation, subterranean exit mapping. While my high school friends were doing keg stands and falling in love, I was practicing how to breathe evenly during an ambush drill in near-freezing water. I never wore a full uniform, not officially, but every stitch of my being was woven with operational precision. By 27, I was embedded in a multi-theater recon group operating under Joint Strategic Intel. By 32, I was designing real-time analysis for field agents in Eastern Europe. By 34, I led silent counterops, uncredited, untraceable. I didn't exist in the world my family could search. But once, years into the work, I received a package with no return address, just a folded shirt. Dad's handwriting stitched into the tag. What they don't see is what keeps them safe. I sat with it for hours, didn't cry, didn't smile. Just breathed. In the end, my father never asked me for details, never demanded answers. Only said, during his final lucid hour in the hospital, "I told them you were doing something important." They laughed, called it delusion. "But you and I know, Kessler, the work doesn't need applause, just clarity." He paused, coughed once, then added, "When the time comes, don't let them bury me in noise. No false honors, no made-up speeches, just give me the silver." I nodded, and now, standing at the back of a chapel thick with misremembering, listening to Russell rewrite a man he never understood, I kept my word. At 10:47 sharp they would see it, not a folded lie, but the truth in silver and stars. 10:47 a.m., right on time. The doors at the back of the chapel swung open, not from wind, not from hesitation, but with the quiet precision of a well-drilled team. 4 soldiers entered. Full dress uniform, white gloves, metal bars catching the low light, and in their hands, a folded silver flag resting inside a glass-topped ceremonial case. The room turned. Chairs creaked. Aunt Marlena gasped. Uncle Russell's mouth stopped mid-sentence. One of the soldiers stepped forward, removed his hat, and announced, "Per request of Colonel Luke Kessler, retired United States Army, the Department of Defense honors this veteran with final rights under Code Silver Directive 314. Authorization was granted by Colonel Julia R. Kessler, ranking officer of Joint Strategic Reconnaissance Division, United States Army." Silence and then whiplash. Every head snapped toward me still in the back. Still in gray, still holding the envelope Dad gave me 3 weeks before he died. I stepped forward slowly, not because I was nervous, but because I'd timed it. Every step, every breath, every syllable I was about to say. Russell moved to block my path, one arm half raised in confusion. "Wait, Julia, what the hell is this?" I met his eyes. "Step aside, Mr. Kessler," I said. "You've had your version, now he gets his." He hesitated, but something in my voice, or maybe in the rigid posture of the soldiers behind me, made him move. I walked to the front, turned toward the crowd, and for the first time in 15 years, I spoke as myself, not the girl who left, not the niece who vanished, not the disappointment, but the daughter of Luke Kessler and his equal. I opened the envelope. Inside, one page, written in my father's hand, his final words, "If they doubt you, let them. But when they gather for me, I want silence broken only by the truth. Speak it plain, Jules, no guilt, no softness, just what matters." I looked up and I told them that I wasn't a dropout, wasn't a nomad, wasn't some overeducated spinster consulting for defense contractors. I was a colonel in the United States Army. I had held 2 field commands under operational silence. I had planned the recon protocol that saved 42 American lives in eastern Kyrgyzstan. And 3 years ago, I had led a civilian extraction in southern Zabul, rescuing the last remaining members of Dad's former unit. Yes, his unit, his men, his legacy. I paused, letting it sink in. "You didn't see me," I said quietly, "but I was there, just not where you wanted me to be." A rustle moved through the chapel. Confusion, shame, awe all blending into a thick, hot silence. I nodded toward the honor guard. They stepped forward, laid the silver flag at the front of the casket, and then, without music, without flourish, offered the full salute. A low note blew on the bugle. Not taps, just 3 solemn chords, enough to shake the dust off every assumption in the room. When I turned around, Russell was no longer near the pulpit. He stood off to the side, hands at his sides, eyes dark and unsure. I walked past him. Didn't make eye contact, because I didn't need his understanding. I had something far more powerful now, visibility. And once they see you, truly see you, they can never unsee it. I didn't stay for the reception. Didn't sit for coffee in the church annex or sip tepid lemonade beside the cousins who never learned how to say my name without a question mark. Instead, I walked out the side door, past the weathered pews and bulletin boards and fake silk lilies, and stood alone beneath the portico as the sun broke through. The soldiers had left. Their job was done. The silver flag was resting on Dad's casket like a quiet correction, and inside the chapel, the whispers had already begun. "She said Colonel, right? I thought she worked in tech or something." Russell never mentioned any of this. "Do you think it was all real? Those men, that flag?" She didn't even cry. She didn't need to. The thing about truth is, it doesn't shout, it just sits, immovable, unbothered by who's ready for it and who is. I stood by the stone path as people trickled out in small clumps. Some looked away. Some nodded. One elderly man, Dad's old mechanic, paused beside me and said, "He was proud of you, you know. I didn't get it before. I think I do now." That was enough. I was about to leave when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, intentional, Russell. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, not in defense, but in disarray. "Was it true?" he asked. No sarcasm this time, no disdain, just something raw and unfamiliar. "Yes," I said, "all of it." He scratched his jaw. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," I replied. He opened his mouth, closed it again. like he was trying to choose between two scripts and neither one fit. I thought you ran off. I thought you were embarrassed by us, by him. I turned to face him fully. No, I was following in his footsteps. You just weren't looking in the right direction. A long pause, then, that salute, that flag, he exhaled, chest heavy. I've never seen anything like it. You weren't supposed to, I said. It wasn't for show. He flinched a little at that, and I almost walked away right then. But something stopped me, not mercy, not forgiveness, closure. You used to say I was cold, I said. Hard to talk to, hard to understand. Russell nodded once, and I get it, I continued. Because I was doing things I couldn't explain, couldn't legally say out loud. I buried most of myself under 10 layers of clearance. I stopped showing up to family dinners. I disappeared behind secure firewalls and foreign soil. You were right about that part. I stepped forward, not to intimidate, but to be heard, fully, finally. But don't mistake silence for shame. Don't mistake distance for disinterest. And don't mistake your lack of imagination for the truth of who I became. Russell looked down, then up. I misjudged you, he admitted, voice rough, for years. That's not the part that hurt, I said. He blinked. Then what was? You made other people believe it too. A light breeze passed between us. It carried the faint sound of Aunt Marlena laughing awkwardly near the catering table. Life would resume, of course. Death never paused it for long. Russell didn't try to defend himself, didn't apologize either. He just nodded again, then turned to go. Julia, he paused at the path's edge. I looked over. He swallowed hard. You earned something out there, more than I ever did here. I didn't respond, because some truths aren't meant to be applauded, just finally recognized. That afternoon, I returned to Dad's house. The porch was still the same, creaky, chipped, too many memories soaked into the grain of the wood. I didn't go inside, just sat on the steps for a while, watching the town fade back into its familiar roles, farmers, teachers, retirees, skeptics. I used to think I didn't belong here. Now, I realized something different. They never had the tools to recognize someone like me. And I never needed them to. Dad did, and that was enough. The letter came 3 days later. No envelope. Just folded once, slipped under the door of Dad's old house where I'd been staying to sort through the last of his effects. It wasn't long. Julia, if you have 10 minutes, I'd like to ask you something, not as your uncle, just as someone who got it wrong. Russell. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was unsure whether to go, but because it was the first time in 20 years he hadn't signed a message with a title. Not uncle. Not family. Just Russell. I met him the next morning at the VFW hall. It was empty, chairs stacked, flags furled. Only the ghost of past service clinging to the air like pipe smoke. Russell sat near the back, crumpled jacket, mismatched socks, the quiet posture of a man who'd run out of arguments. He stood as I entered but didn't approach. I walked over, sat 2 chairs away, enough space for truth, not enough for performance. I read your file, he said after a moment. I tilted my head. Which one? The publicly released commendation. Zabel operation. They called it textbook extraction. It wasn't, I said flatly, but we got them out. He nodded, then paused. I thought I knew what service looked like, he said. Rallies, voter drives, memorial speeches, streets named after sergeants. He looked at me now. But you served in a way I never even considered possible. I said nothing, because the point wasn't to be thanked. Then he asked the question I hadn't expected. Did he ask you not to tell us about the work you were doing? My jaw tightened. I could have lied, could have said yes to make him feel less guilty, but truth doesn't ask permission to be uncomfortable. No, I said. He didn't ask, he didn't have to, he just understood. Russell swallowed. That's what I didn't get, that the silence wasn't distance, it was discipline. Now we were getting closer, to the real question, the one behind his eyes, and then, quietly, he asked it. Was I the reason you left? I looked at him, really looked. At the man who once told me girls like me were too serious, that I should smile more before I scared off a husband. That military work was fine if it didn't harden the heart. I could have recited every jab, every insult wrapped in concern, Every time he dismissed my ambition as rebellion. But instead, I said this: "No, you weren't the reason I left. You were the reason I didn't come back." He closed his eyes, and for once didn't defend himself, just nodded. Once, like someone accepting the weight of a sentence he'd avoided all his life. Then he said, "I was threatened by who you were becoming, because I saw a kind of strength I couldn't control." I stood slowly, not in anger, in closure. "I never needed you to control it," I said. "I just needed you not to belittle it." He opened his mouth, but I raised a hand. "You don't get to talk first this time." He froze. I took a breath. "I'm not here for revenge or for tears. I'm not even here for an apology. I came to tell you one thing." He waited. "You don't get to write my legacy. You had the mic for years, now it's mine. And I'll use it the way I learned from Dad, clear, precise, with nothing wasted." I turned to leave, but then paused at the door. He was still sitting there, small beneath a mural of fallen names he never expected I'd join. He asked one last time, his voice barely audible, "Do you think your father forgave me?" I looked back, and with no bitterness, I said, "He didn't hold a grudge, but he stopped trusting you the day you started treating me like a disappointment instead of a daughter." Russell's shoulders slumped, and for once he didn't follow me out. He just sat there, in the quiet, with the weight of a truth he couldn't outrank. Outside, the morning sun hit the asphalt. I zipped up my jacket, tapped my comms switch out of habit, then smiled to myself. There was no one listening today, no debrief, no encrypted file, just me, walking away from the last conversation I'd never thought I'd have, and feeling lighter. Not because he changed, but because I didn't need him to anymore. The military doesn't do sentiment, it does protocol, procedure, precision. And yet, when I stood beneath the black stone wall at the Strategic Reconnaissance Training Division 3 weeks later, something inside me shifted. Because for the first time in 18 years, I saw my father's name etched in stone. Colonel Luke A. Kessler, 1971-2024. Deployed, returned, remembered. It wasn't flashy. No flowers, no wreaths. Just engraved letters. Even, clean, permanent. Beside it, a small silver icon, a jet tilted mid-climb. A symbol reserved for those who died in training ops deemed high-risk intel development missions. No bodies recovered. No black box returned. Just folded reports, unofficial legends, and a family left staring at a sky that never gave back what it took. I stood in uniform, full regalia. No sunglasses, no emotion on my face. But my hand stayed at my side, fingers twitching once as the honor bell rang out. 3 tolls, one for service, one for sacrifice, one for silence. I didn't cry, because tears are public currency. And this moment wasn't for the public. It was for him, for the man who taught me that quiet doesn't mean weak, that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the leader. After the ceremony, an older woman approached me. Civilian clothes, gray blazer, no insignia. But her eyes, sharp as satellite imagery, clear as battlefield wind, she extended a hand. "Commander Rivera," she said, "I read your full report. Zabel, Code Echo 19, Operation Cradle." I took her hand, firm grip. "Yes, ma'am." She studied me. "You wrote one of the cleanest post-ops I've seen in 10 years. You didn't dramatize, you didn't editorialize, you just told the truth." I nodded. "That's how he taught me," I said, gesturing toward the wall. Rivera followed my gaze. Then she gave a small nod of respect, not to me but to the name on the stone. "You know," she said, "most people climb rank because they want to be saluted. You." She paused. "You made rank so you could shield people better." I didn't respond, because she was right, and because that truth didn't need decorating. Later that afternoon, I walked the edge of the airfield. New recruits were arriving. Young, nervous, too stiff in their boots. Their duffel bags still had retail tags. I passed a group of them near the gate. One of them whispered, loud enough for it to reach me, "That's her, Kessler's daughter, the one who never came back until she came back with stars." I didn't stop, didn't correct him, because sometimes a myth tells the truth better than the facts ever could. That evening, I returned to my quarters. Base housing, functional, clean, Quiet, I opened the top drawer of my desk. Inside, one item, a photo, Dad and me, age 9. Standing in front of a decommissioned jet at the local air show. I was pointing to the sky. He was looking at me like the sky had already answered. Behind the photo was a sticky note, his handwriting. Never wait for permission to be exactly who you are. I smiled, a rare, small thing, but real. Then I opened my laptop. Typed one sentence into the classified training syllabus for new recon analysts. Your silence may save lives someday. Learn to wield it with care, not fear. Then I closed it because the work never ends. But some chapters finally settle. The ceremony was small, 12 cadets, a cloudless sky, and the echo of boots on concrete that hadn't yet learned rhythm. I stood at the front, not on a podium, just flat ground, same level. Because real leadership doesn't need elevation, only presence. Each of them saluted me as they passed, some too quickly, some too stiff. One cadet, barely 19, held the salute for a full second too long, his voice cracking slightly as he said, "Colonel Kessler, ma'am, it's an honor." I didn't correct him, didn't tell him I was now a brigadier general, recently confirmed but not yet announced, because he wasn't honoring my title. He was honoring the weight I carried to get here, and that was enough. After the line had passed, I stepped aside, let them move into formation, watched as they fumbled through the first iteration of what would become second nature, and then I saw her, standing alone near the back of the viewing area. No military ID, no badge, just a navy blouse I hadn't seen in years, the one she wore to my high school graduation. My mother, she wasn't smiling, wasn't crying, just standing there. One hand at her side, the other gently pressed against her chest, like she was keeping herself anchored to the moment. I didn't walk over, didn't wave. Because some connections don't need ceremony, just recognition. Later that evening, I returned to the house. Not the base quarters, the house, Dad's house, now mine. Mom had already left earlier that day, after helping me sort through the last few storage bins. She didn't say much, but before she stepped out the door, she turned and said, "You didn't just survive him, Jules. You honored him in ways he never needed an audience for. And that's how I know he was proud." I nodded, didn't speak, because some sentences only need to be heard once to echo forever. I walked to the old study, the one Dad had built with his own hands after Mom passed. The room was sparse now, just a bookshelf, a folded chair, and one wall that used to be cluttered with plaques, photos, commendations. I opened the small box I'd brought with me from the base. Inside, a silver falcon pin, a mission patch from Zabel, stitched with 5 stars, and a framed photo. The photo, me, age 16, standing next to a science fair project built from soda bottles and salvaged wires, grinning, covered in grease, pointing to a hand-painted sign that read, "Jet propulsion, flight without permission." Beneath it, a post-it note in my mother's handwriting. "You didn't ask for permission, but you gave everyone else the courage to stop asking too." I held the frame in my hands, then placed it gently on the shelf above the desk. No spotlight, no plaque, just there, because that's what still stands, not the judgment, not the whispers, not the years lost trying to explain yourself to people who stopped listening before you spoke. What stands is this: a name earned, a mission kept, a daughter grown into the exact woman they said she couldn't be. That night I sat on the porch. No uniform, no voice commands, no encrypted lines buzzing in my ear, just moonlight. And the memory of a man who once said, "The quiet ones, when they rise, make the ground shift beneath them." He was right, and now I have a new class to brief tomorrow, and I don't need anyone's permission to stand at the head of the room.